Hormonal control of menstrual cycle. The functioning of the female reproductive system has synchronized events controlled by 4 hormones, namely follicle stimulating hormone or FSH, estrogen, luteinizing hormone or LH, and progesterone. This series of synchronized events occur in a regular pattern called the menstrual cycle. In humans, the cycle takes about 28 days in the female and is marked by discharge of blood and tissue debris called menstruation. The cycle is conveniently divided into 4 phases. Each phase has characteristic events that take place. Now, conventionally, the first day of the cycle is taken to be the day menstruation starts. Remember, menstruation is the discharge of blood and tissue debris from the reproductive system through the vagina in the form of menses. So, day 1 of the menstrual cycle is marked by the first day that the menses or the menstrual flow takes place. So the first phase, known as the menstrual phase, is the most conspicuous because it is marked by the menses or the menstrual flow, in which the endometrium, the innermost layer of the uterine wall, breaks down, and the pieces of blood, tissue, and other tissues, the glandular tissue that make up the endometrium, are passed out through the vagina as menses. At the same time, while the endometrium is breaking down, the pituitary gland secretes the hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, which will stimulate the development of a primary follicle in the ovary into an ovum. So the development of a primary follicle in the ovary ushers in the next phase known as the follicular phase. During this phase, a primary follicle develops into a mature follicle which will later release an ovum. As the primary follicle develops in the ovary, it secretes the hormone estrogen. Estrogen stimulates the proliferation of the uterine wall and brings about the repair. So the wall that had broken down, the endometrium, heals during the follicular phase. At the same time, estrogen also stimulates the production of luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. So as the level of estrogen rises in the blood, the high level will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete the hormone luteinizing. That is the luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone has the following effects. 1, it brings about ovulation. You can see here the ovum has been released from the ovary into the fallopian tube. So the luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland brings about ovulation. Also, the high level of estrogen, apart from stimulating the release of luteinizing hormone, the high levels also inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone through negative feedback. So you see, the follicle stimulating hormone stimulated the development of a primary follicle, which in turn increases the secretion of estrogen. High levels of estrogen inhibit further release of follicle stimulating hormone. So that is an example of negative feedback. So once the high levels of estrogen have stimulated the release of luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland, ovulation occurs. which ushers in the third phase, that is the ovulation phase. So during ovulation, an ovum is released into the fallopian tube. So usually, ovulation occurs in either of the two ovaries. It can be either the left one or on the right side. The levels of luteinizing hormone will continue to rise. Other than inducing ovulation, luteinizing hormone will stimulate the remains of the follicle, known as the Graafian follicle, to become a yellow body known as corpus luteum. So there's a formation of a body known as a corpus luteum in the ovary after ovulation has taken place, and the formation of the corpus luteum is brought about by the luteinizing hormone. Then the luteinizing hormone will stimulate the corpus luteum to release another hormone, that is the progesterone. So progesterone is released from the corpus luteum. Now this ushers in the luteal phase. During the luteal phase, the progesterone causes the proliferation of the uterine wall in preparation for implantation. And also progesterone prevents this uterine wall from breaking down. In addition, progesterone also inhibits production of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone through negative feedback. So, at the start of the menstrual cycle, the endometrium breaks down and there's a menstrual flow. While this is happening, the pituitary gland will release the follicle-stimulating hormone, which will stimulate a follicle to develop. Now, as the follicle develops, that is the follicular phase, more estrogen is released. So the levels of estrogen in the blood will rise, and the role of the estrogen is to bring the repair and healing of the broken down wall and also stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone will bring about ovulation and also will bring about the formation of the corpus luteum in the ovary. Luteinizing hormone also stimulates the corpus luteum to release the hormone progesterone. Progesterone brings about further proliferation of the uterine wall, and it maintains the endometrium, preventing it from breaking down. So that marks the luteal phase. Now, if fertilization fails, the corpus luteum persists for only about 14 days, that is the period of the luteal phase, after which it breaks down, leading to a decrease in the progesterone level. In the absence of the progesterone to maintain the endometrium, the uterine wall begins to disintegrate and menstrual flow resumes after the 28th day. So that is a synchronized cycle of events that take place during the menstrual cycle. Now you can see the relationship between the hormones in the cycle. Two of them are ovarian, that is produced by the ovaries, and this is the progesterone and estrogen, while two of them are pituitary hormones, that is the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. So as mentioned earlier, the first day of the cycle begins with the menstrual flow, and as the menstrual flow takes place, follicle stimulating hormone, the level will increase. This increase of the follicle stimulating hormone is a pituitary hormone. So the rise in the follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate the development of a follicle. So here you can see the follicle developing. So during the menstruation phase, the endometrium breaks down and you have menstrual flow. While this is taking place, the level of follicle stimulating hormone rises, and this follicle stimulating hormone stimulates a primary follicle to develop, to mature and become the mature follicle. As the follicle is developing, more estrogen is secreted, so the level of estrogen rises. When it reaches its peak between the 12th and 14th day, that is the levels of estrogen, this peak level will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete luteinizing hormone at about the 14th, between 12th and 14th day. This peak release of luteinizing hormone brings about ovulation. Once ovulation has taken place, the luteinizing hormone will also stimulate the remains of the follicle to become the corpus luteum. In addition, luteinizing hormone will stimulate the corpus luteum to secrete progesterone. So the level of progesterone rises after ovulation. The progesterone brings about further proliferation of the uterine wall and maintains it, preventing it from breaking down. So the luteal phase begins from after ovulation, that is at about the 14th day, and depending on whether fertilization will take place or not. If there is no fertilization, this corpus luteum regresses. And when it regresses, the level of progesterone drops drastically. With the drop of the progesterone level, this endometrium cannot be maintained. So it breaks down. And you have a menstrual flow, and the cycle starts all over again. So there's a breakdown of the menstrual, of the endometrial wall, resulting in menstruation. As menstruation is taking place, because there is no progesterone to inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone, the follicle stimulating hormone levels rise. This follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the development of a follicle, so ushering in the follicular phase. As the follicle is developing, more estrogen is released, so the level of estrogen will go up. But this estrogen is released by the developing follicle. The levels of estrogen will rise to a point where it will stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone by the pituitary gland. And also the estrogen brings about the repair of the uterine wall. Another effect of the estrogen is that it inhibits the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. That's why the levels go down. But at peak, when the estrogen levels reach a certain peak, not only does it stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone, it also stimulates a release of follicle stimulating hormone. In other words, this high level of estrogen has a stimulatory effect on the pituitary gland in that it will release both the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone. It is the luteinizing hormone that brings about ovulation. After ovulation, the luteinizing hormone stimulates the development of the corpus luteum from the remains of the follicle. This corpus luteum is also stimulated by the luteinizing hormone to secrete the hormone progesterone, thus ushering in the luteal phase, during which the uterine wall is further repaired and is maintained at its greatest thickness. Depending on whether there is fertilization or not, the levels of progesterone may drop. So as the levels of progesterone rise, the level of follicle stimulating hormone will go down, because one of the effects of progesterone is to inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone and also to inhibit the release of luteinizing hormone. If there is no fertilization, the corpus luteum regresses and When with the regression of the corpus luteum, progesterone level will drop. With the drop in progesterone levels, the wall cannot be maintained and it breaks down, ushering in the next cycle, that is the menstrual flow begins all over again.